Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining a Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Joining Diana today is Rebecca Miner. Rebecca is a neuroqueer, femme clinician, consultant, and educator specializing in the intersection of trauma, gender, and sexuality. As a gender specialist, Rebecca partners with trans and gender nonconforming youth through their journey of becoming and is a guide to their parents in affirming it. She is part-time faculty at the Boston University School of Social Work and also works through a lens that is neurodiversity-affirming, trauma-informed, and also resilient-oriented. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rebecca. I will now pass the conversation over to Diana.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome, Rebecca. I'm really excited to have you educate me a little bit. As we were talking in the pre-show, we're going to be discussing the intersection of neurodiversity, gender identity, sexual identification, questioning all of those things. And for those of us who are really good at putting things in little boxes, until this conversation, I was really good at thinking about somebody as somebody on the spectrum or somebody trans, but I wasn't melding those two boxes. How frequent, and welcome, I'll start there before I ask my first question.
That's okay. Thank you so much. You can fire away.
Can I pummel you? Okay. So what is the incidence? Are there statistics surrounding it? Is this a common phenomena?
Yes, it is a common phenomenon. So, well, first I'll just validate your experience that most often people do group into those boxes, right? They're like, I know some trans people, I know some autistic people, and those groups don't necessarily overlap. However, because we're all human and we're thinking more intersectionally these days, we know that there's actually a really high incidence of those boxes being melded together. So autistic people are more likely to identify as non-heterosexual. In a study done in 2018, about 69% of autistic participants identified as non-heterosexual. So that's almost 70%.
With the general population.
Significant.
10, 20%?
Right. Yeah. So
wow,
that's a really dramatic amount, right? So about 4.5 of the general population identifies as non-heterosexual. So that's a notable difference. I believe the number is more like what you cited. I think, but right. The research we have says 4.5. But yeah, so that's specific. And then to around sexuality in terms of autism and transness, the most up-to-date research shows that people who do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth are 3 to 6 times as likely to be autistic. So that's a significant number to consider as well.
So, which leads me to wonder, is it often that the trans issue is addressed and then the autism spectrum disorder is sort of discovered? Or is it the other way around? I'm just curious about how the evolution of an individual's understanding might come to be.
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think it happens both ways. In my clinical experience, it happened with the majority of my clients was that they figured out the trans piece first and then the neurodivergence later. However, I read a lot of anecdotes from folks online who say they figured out the autism piece and then they figured out the gender and sexuality pieces later. And for some people, it happens at the same time. They kind of go hand in hand. And in some ways, the autism diagnosis is freeing for some folks to feel like, oh, this makes some sense now and explains some of these other ways in which I'm not really feeling connected to social constructs around gender and sexuality.
That makes complete sense. So, what is the youngest you tend to work with people? How early in this journey do you often get involved?
So in my individual therapy work, I work with people 12 and up, but as a camp counselor who works in that space, and when I do parent coaching, I've seen kids as young as 3 and 4.
3 and 4 who are identifying as not feeling comfortable in their gender.
Yes.
Interesting. How does that manifest for somebody 3 or 4?
Oftentimes it manifests in, either desire to play with certain toys or wear or not wear certain clothing, upset around hair related things like not wanting to get a haircut or, wanting to have short hair, or the actual verbalization of like, I'm not a boy or I am a girl. And parents are like, no, you're not. And they're like, no, I am. And those conversations happen that early. Like
And
from a gender development.
What lucky kids if their parents are actually getting that message at 3 or 4 as opposed to 20 and 24. Yeah.
If their parents listen. Yeah. Yeah. And it's amazing when they do, they can have much happier, healthier childhoods than for the kids who, you and I don't end up seeing until teen or young adult years when they may be really struggling because they've been trying to express it and it never landed somewhere where they got the support that they needed.
Right. You can't not turn on the news right now and hear legislation about trans limitation and drag shows. I mean, just really, really reeling back when we think about ways of marginalizing a population. How is that affecting your client base?
It's dramatically affecting my clients. I practice in Massachusetts, so both myself and my clients have the privilege of feeling pretty protected from a lot of the anti-trans legislation that's happening, right? Knowing that they themselves won't lose access to care or not be able to see me anymore because I'll be in prison. But in other states, that could be the case for doing the job that I do. And I think just seeing the kind of persistent onslaught of headlines and posts and things, it's pretty impossible to avoid at this point. And so for many of them, there's this kind of constant feeling that just people don't want them here, or that there's something so inherently wrong with them that it's being like legally banned for them to exist. So it's a very scary time.
And is the suicide rate in your population that you specialize in higher than the norm as well?
Yes, 4 times higher.
So we've got kids on the spectrum who are questioning or gender diverse or sexually diverse, and their risk of suicide is that much higher.
All the risks go up in terms of like mental health concerns. However, it's important to note that when they have access to adequate support and care, those numbers go down dramatically.
Is that right?
So we know that family acceptance is huge. Community support is incredible. And one of my kind of go-to stats from the Trevor Project is that just one affirming adult can reduce the incidence of suicidality down to from 40%. So it's like you can be that person, right? One person can actually make that kind of impact of just being an affirming adult. You don't have to get it.
What does an affirming adult sound like? Let's go to the basic.
Sure. I think one challenge for folks is they often feel like they have to know everything or understand everything to be able to show up. And I would say to be an affirming adult, you can ask questions and be curious, and not in a prying or inappropriate way, but just in a like, what does that word mean to you? Or like, I want to make sure I understand, like when you share with me that you're queer, how does that
mean?
Make sense to you? Because, maybe when you were growing up, that was a bad word. And so, times have changed. But really just kind of joining with the person and meeting them where they are to say, like, whatever you're thinking and feeling, I'm here with you. And you're welcome in my house or my community or our faith space or whatever it is, as you're going through this journey, whether it's questioning or absolutely clear, to just continue to affirm that ultimately that people are welcome in your space, and know that you're a safe person to go to.
Yeah, that's lovely. A welcoming space.
Yeah.
How does the traditional therapies, and I'm going to ask this in a way that I don't mean disparaging, but the traditional therapies for people who are neurodivergent or people who are gender questioning may fall short. Why would that happen? Because you see that, I see that. What modes tend to fall short with people who are in the process of exploring these issues for themselves?
So some of our more cognitive based practices, can go either way for folks. Either they really like the kind of rigidity of the process, but where it lacks kind of, I think, the nuance of things is that these aren't automatic thoughts or things that we need to provide evidence for in the way that some of those modalities require, and don't allow for a kind of more expansive exploration of what could be. And I think certainly the more behavioral side of, what has been ABA type practices, don't allow for that either. And I think, there's a big push in the neurodivergent community to say that those types of practices are actually harmful, and not supportive of people kind of leaning into their neurodivergence or allowing themselves to unmask, rather than teaching people the skills of like how to kind of pass as neurotypical, in the same way that we kind of force people to try to do that around gender as well.
So what a box they're asked to put in, right? Gender box, the neurotypical box, God knows what else. So I like it for opening these boxes for people and letting them themselves. Yeah.
And it was a learning process for me too, because it wasn't a really present part of my training. And I think like right now, the field as a whole is dramatically shifting around our understandings of neurodivergence. I had been working with some of my clients for years, without realizing that what they were describing was absolutely autism. Until I started to look through that lens and was like, whoa, wait a minute. Are most of the people, hang on, this is like a lot to take in. And then also unpacking my own neurodivergence and understanding how that shows up personally and professionally. And there are many strengths,
which may look very different than a lot of the data.
And yes,
applies to young boys, frankly. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that's a major reason that it was not something I was familiar with, right? I had kind of a picture of autism, and it's the research we were provided in grad school and undergrad that was very focused on like 8-year-old boys who like trains, who are white, cisgender, heterosexual, right? And that's who was being studied. And so there wasn't a lot of discourse around what ADHD could look like in women or what autism looks like in women. And certainly now with the trans population, this is a growing area of research. And some of the measures themselves that we use diagnostically kind of cancel out, someone might not meet criteria because it doesn't fit. And so people are kind of going rogue and making other diagnostic tools that aren't necessarily, peer reviewed and all the things. But they're really fantastic and really open up some interesting and fruitful conversations, at least with clients, of
and
things around
that the tool is only supposed to get you to those fruitful conversations anyway, right?
Exactly. And like, I think a major misstep that a lot of us have around autism is that people who are autistic don't experience empathy or feel a lot. And that's so incorrect. And it's also a reason why a lot of women don't get diagnosed, because they're like, oh, well, she has social skills, or like seems comfortable relating to other people or cares about other people. And what people are missing is there's actually what's sometimes considered a hyper empathy response, where it makes it almost physically painful to watch like upsetting movies, for example. And that level of response is actually a demonstration of the very same diagnosis that we think people can't possibly have.
Right. So what didn't I ask you that you want us to know?
What didn't you ask me? I think that's a great question. I think one thing that's important to think about is sensory sensitivities. And that gets left out of the conversation a lot clinically, and just in terms of accessibility when we think about just, gathering as humans. There are ways that we can be more supportive or considerate around those pieces. And also when we're with clients trying to diagnose some of these things, to maybe pay attention if there are sensory sensitivities that clients won't necessarily bring up. And so some of it is about asking the right questions, or noticing kind of when clients respond to different things in different ways, and understanding that sometimes the resistance that we might see as like, oh, you just don't want to get a job, it's more complicated than that. It's that like the grocery store is actually incredibly overwhelming because of the fluorescent lights and the sounds, and there are workarounds for that. But we need to know what those are to be able to support people effectively.
That's great feedback for all of us if we want to be curious about another person's experience, right?
Absolutely. Right. Or even ourselves, right? Like people have these sensitivities to things and they're like, oh, it's just a quirky me thing. And it's like, well, maybe. But maybe it's more than that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I like it. Well, thank you for joining me today, Rebecca. This has been an amazing.
Absolutely.
And for those of you who are watching, Rebecca can be found at thegenderspecialist.com. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.